The chair for the session, Ambassador Dr. Mohan Kumar, Chairman, Research and Information System for Developing Countries. For the special address, I would like to invite on stage Dr. Anup Wadhawan, Commerce Secretary, Government of India. And the panelists for the session, Dr. Carlos Maria Correia, Executive Director, South Center, Geneva. Mr. John Hancock, Senior Counselor in the Economic Research and Statistics Division, WTO, Geneva. Dr. Vardhan Singh, former Deputy Director General, WTO, Geneva. Dr. Vo T. Thanh, Senior Advisor, Central Institute for Economic Management, Hanoi, Vietnam. Over to the chair for the session, Ambassador Dr. Mohan Kumar.
Very much. Very good evening to all of you. In accordance with the high standards established during the day, and I have to say, all the panels were absolutely superb, but I have such a distinguished panel for this particular subject as well. Particularly grateful to the Commerce Secretary, because you have to put yourself in the shoes of the Commerce Secretary to know the kind of schedule you have these days. I'm particularly grateful to him for having taken Saturday off and come here, which will be of great benefit to the audience. Without much ado, and we will talk about the panel discussions later, where I have a few things to say. But right now, I'm just going to request the Honorable Commerce Secretary to give his opening remarks on the future of the multilateral trading system as seen by India. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you so much for the very warm welcome. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, the very distinguished panelists on the dais, and the very distinguished participants in this session. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. I'm most delighted to be here, and my thanks to the organizers for making that possible. So clearly, to be very forthright and somewhat blunt, the multilateral trading system as embodied in the WTO stands severely disrupted today and stands, virtually non-functional. On top of years of subtle and sometimes not so subtle protectionism, you have reached a stage where we saw unilateral actions by various countries, unilateralism involving non-abidance by the established rules of the WTO. You had, security exceptions being used by the most prosperous nations in the world. Nations, sometimes the S can be removed at the end. And these were countries who benefited the most from the global economic order that was established after World War II. And in fact, they had benefited the most even from the pre-World War II global economic order. So you reached a situation where the established rules of the system were not being abided by through unilateral actions involving the invocation of some very specious security clauses. For instance, the US imposed steel aluminum duties on security grounds, whereas they produced 80% of their steel and aluminum, and the remaining 20% was largely imported from some very, very close strategic partners, and yet the security ground was imposed. And this situation is compounded by the fact that today you have a situation of non-enforceability of rules. The appellate body of the WTO, as we all know, has collapsed. The quorum required is no longer there, and nomination of new members is being disrupted by the same sort of elements, if I may say so, who brought in the unilateralism, who brought in the non-abidance with the rules. So clearly the prognosis doesn't look good. Prognosis looks bad. There seems to be no sort of light at the end of the tunnel. There don't seem to be, live, active channels through which one can hope some desirable outcomes can materialize. So at one level it is disappointing, but at another level it is not surprising. If you look at how the global economic order has evolved, you'll see a pattern to it, and in a sense, what has emerged is not surprising. It is consistent with the way the global economic order evolved. It is consistent with some underlying characteristics that the global economic order always had. So let's look back and see how that economic order evolved. Let me go back to the pre-industrial revolution age, when countries like India and China dominated the world economy, they dominated world trade, and that in a sense was an age of pure free trade. You had trade largely devoid of politics. You had trade, the foundation of which was in small enterprise. There was complete competition at the production end. It involved, taking significant risk and trading across borders, across the seas. And there again, there was an element of competition as far as the trading element itself was concerned. And largely, the nation state was not directly involved with the political economy of trade, which was largely governed by economic causes. This was followed by the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution saw a situation of technological domination or technological dominance of the Western world, and it got combined with certain political influences on trade. Through the process of colonization, you increasingly had the state involved in the political economy of trade. You had examples like the East India Company, sponsored by the state, supported by the state, and in some senses, a politicized form of trade evolved in the post-industrial revolution age. And if you see the characteristics of that period, in many ways, they persist with us even today. And that is why I say that it's not very surprising as to how things have shaped in the multilateral system. And of course, industrial revolution, colonization, it led to the typical colonial pattern of trade, exploitation of primary resources, exploitation of raw materials based on political and economic domination, and of course, manufactured goods being produced by the developed world and being exported to developing countries. Then, of course, we reached, World War II, and post-World War II, as the world emerged from the horrors of that war, there was an apparent change of heart. There appeared to be some sort of pangs of conscience at the way the world had evolved thus far and at the horrors of World War II. And there was, a voice for freedom for the colonies. Even, President Roosevelt spoke about the developed world or the colonial powers losing their colonies after the war was over. So there appeared to be a change of heart. And there was talk of, economic aid. There was talk of technical assistance. There was talk of technology sharing with developing countries. And in fact, technology sharing was a part of developing country demands all the way through after World War II. Of course, technology sharing in exchange for accessing markets has become somewhat controversial of late in the US-China context, but it was always a demand of developing countries. And this led to, of course, the multilateral trading system evolving under GATT, under the WTO. WTO improved upon the GATT arrangements. It brought in the system of consensus. It reinforced the principles of special and differential treatment. It brought in a two-stage appellate process, a transparent process for resolving disputes, and it brought in a development focus. So it appeared that, we were learning from the past and we were turning a new leaf, so to say. However, the outcomes that emerged were somewhat disappointing for developing countries. You saw very, very legalistic agreements. You saw agreements which turned out to be very unfair for developing countries. You had agreements like the Agreement on Agriculture, where the huge subsidies of the developed world were protected and are still protected. Those subsidies were put into some legal boxes, blue box and green box, with the myth that they were non-distorting, and they're clearly not non-distorting. If you remove them, you'll see the agricultural production shift in accordance with comparative advantage which lies in the developing world. So you had a very legalistic process for which developing countries were not really equipped. And they were also amenable to coming under pressure. Many developing countries had close to 70-80% of their budget supported by aid. So in that situation, you were not in a position to resist these outcomes, and the result was that many of these agreements which we negotiated under this new order were very, very unfair to developing countries. Then again, there seemed to be a realization. There was talk about implementation issues which needed to be addressed for the underlying intent of these agreements to be realized. There was some, lip service paid to implementation issues. You had the Doha round, which was envisaged with a developmental focus. But that hope was also belied, and very soon the Doha round came to a complete halt, and we realized that that expression of faith in the principles which the Doha round embodied was very shallow and not really sincere. And you had a situation where established mandates were abandoned, mandates which were agreed to at a ministerial level, mandates to renegotiate unfair agreements like the Agreement on Agriculture, mandates to deliver on some key concerns of developing countries. For instance, the public stockholding concern for a country like India, huge population, living at subsistence levels, very fragile and vulnerable to, food security issues. In a situation where that kind of demand was not even possible for the rest of the world to meet, countries like India had some very genuine concerns about issues like public stockholding. So all that, to a larger or lesser extent got abandoned. And I think at Nairobi, finally, it got documented that there was no consensus on that agreed mandate which had been derived in the past from ministerial decisions. And you had new issues coming in. You had e-commerce, you had investment facilitation, all sorts of new issues, and spoke very poorly for the credibility of the system. That you negotiate something over years and years, you agree to something after very, very significant and substantive negotiations, and then you abandon the mandate and say that we need a new mandate for new issues, augurs very poorly for the credibility of the system, and obviously, lack of credibility led to lack of any forward movement on the new issues also. So, you reached a situation where there was no way forward, there was no forward movement on arriving at some reasonable outcomes. There was a complete stalemate, agreed mandates were abandoned, and of course, the new mandates were all highly contested, and there was lack of consensus on them. And then, as I mentioned, the situation today has been further compounded. Not only is there no movement forward, there is a movement in the reverse direction. Your agreed rules are not being abided by, and on top of that, now those rules are not enforceable thanks to the appellate body collapsing. And all this, comes on top of a very subtle legalistic environment of protectionism that was always the undercurrent. You had various measures by way of non-tariff barriers. You had various SPS measures which were non-scientific, including, MRL limits for pesticides, etc., in agricultural products, which are very important for developing countries based on level of detection rather than a system of scientific analysis and risk estimation. You had an effort to bring in various, non-trade issues into trade, issues of labor standards, issues of environmental standards, and all this subtle protectionism, and not so subtle at times, aimed at undoing the comparative advantage of developing countries. Every economy has evolved over time. Every macroeconomy has evolved over time. The wages, labor standards, other standards in the West today have evolved over time. But the effort here was to thrust them unnaturally, prematurely on the developing world and undo that comparative advantage. If in the Indian macroeconomy a certain wage rate is sufficient for survival, then a premature effort to thrust a certain minimum wage which that macroeconomy can't support, or thrust some standards which are not possible to achieve overnight, all those very, very unreasonable, actions happened. And so what I'm saying is, the situation evolved amidst that underlying subtle, protectionism. The other aspect of that was the entire issue of IPR and technology. All this coexisted with the effort to create an IPR regime that was, in my view, quite unbalanced. You see, typically IPR regimes need to balance the concern for encouraging innovation, the concern for encouraging R&D, and balancing that with, public health concerns, public policy concerns. And so clearly the effort was to have a regime which was highly unbalanced, highly in favor of corporates. You had a global pharmaceutical sector, highly prosperous, earning huge profits, and splashing those profits around to create a favorable environment, whether, it was with the medical profession or whether it was with parliamentarians. You saw that an unbalanced IPR regime, and developing countries had to fight and struggle for that balance. India, for instance, had a TRIPS compliant regime which strove for that balance, but the pressure to undo that has been consistent. And the other aspect, of course, of technology sharing. So if you have a regime where IPR protection is unreasonable, where 20 years of patent protection is not sufficient, huge profits of, the patent holders are not seen as reflection of a satisfactory regime from the corporate point of view, and where technology sharing is mere lip service, what you replicate is the same old colonial pattern of trade, where all the value addition lies in the developed world, and developing countries are simply sources for raw materials, labor. So what I'm saying is that the underlying nature of the global economic order did not fundamentally change. It was achieved by certain very overt and somewhat crude methods in the past, but the same objective was attempted to be achieved through certain more subtle and somewhat covert methods. And that brief period of, apparent realization or apparent change of heart has quickly come to an end, and you are again on ground zero, where certain rules which were multilateral, which had some elements of fairness in them, which had some element of promoting equity in the global economic order, they stand abandoned. So that entire facade has come to an end, and today you have a situation where effectively no rules prevail. Countries with economic clout are free to violate them. There is no dispute resolution system which is working today, and what the future holds is hard to predict, but clearly, bilateral arm twisting based on economic clout will be a very, very important element of that global economic order. So let me quickly conclude my remarks by looking at what the future holds for us in this situation. Now, clearly, this outcome is welfare reducing. It's a welfare reducing outcome for the world, and I think the US-China trade dispute is the most convincing real-world validation that barriers to trade are welfare reducing, tariffs are welfare reducing, and I think that realization, although not admitted, has dawned upon the perpetuators of that unilateralism. So one hope is that the world will learn its lessons, or the perpetuators of that unilateralism will learn a lesson the hard way, and let's hope, some realization dawns, some wisdom dawns, and we learn these lessons at the minimal possible price. If it gets perpetuated too long, then the lessons will be learned in a really hard way, which will be inoptimal, which will be welfare reducing, and of course, the brunt of it will be borne by developing countries. I can't predict how the personalities on the world stage will change in the future. Elections are hard to predict, and I think we've seen some very recent results. So there again, one can only hope that, people in the choices they exercise lead to some outcomes which put on the stage personalities with wisdom and foresight, but perhaps that is too much to hope for. And the other aspect is that certain doors, once opened, don't close. Even when the personalities change, there'll be some doors which will never close. This whole option of unilateralism, this whole option of security grounds, however specious they may be, to not abide by rules, that is a door which has been opened forever. And in some senses, it will never close. That is a worrying thing. In some ways, policymakers have tasted blood, and it will be hard to, address that fully in the future. So what are the options? What are the options for countries? What are the options for a country like India, for developing countries, or for that matter, for any country? One option, of course, is to appeal to the better side of the disruptors, give, lectures like the one I'm giving. But let me admit very honestly that that's a lost cause, and the sooner we abandon it as a serious practical measure, the better it is. I mean, for the sake of rhetoric and for the sake of posturing, one can always indulge in it, but in a practical, real sense, that is not an option. Another option, appease the disruptors. Again, I think that happens, consciously or unconsciously through a system of real politics, through a system of the clout of nations being exercised. Some element of appeasement will happen. I think if you see this entire appellate body crisis, clearly that effort to appease the disruptors was there, even, unfortunately, in supposed neutral, bodies, secretariats tend to enter into that appeasement process to appease the disruptors rather than hold them to account and confront them and encourage countries to unitedly confront them. There is an element of appeasement. So whether you wish it or not, that appeasement will happen, but there again, it is not a desirable or optimal policy for any country to follow. It is suboptimal. It will lead to outcomes which will undermine the outcomes which we are trying to protect. The WTO, for instance, embodies certain principles, certain underlying features which need to be protected. So appeasement will only dilute those elements. And there again, there is much talk of some of these outcomes which are being discussed, which would be suboptimal. Which brings me to the third option. The third option is to make yourself strong. Make yourself strong, acquire bargaining power, work with like-minded countries to reduce your vulnerability, work with like-minded countries to create systems which are less vulnerable to disruption by individual countries. Today you have a world economic order which is very, very prone to disruption by the developed world and by some countries in the developed world. So I think like-minded countries must come together and create a system which is less vulnerable to that kind of disruption. And there are some, steps happening in that direction. If you see, countries are working towards some such arrangement, which is logical. And to make yourself strong, to give yourself some bargaining power, you have to make your environment, your domestic environment competitive. Your domestic environment must be competitive in terms of being business friendly, being investor friendly, in terms of affording an environment which is low cost, efficient. I think that needs to be the primary goal of countries today, developing countries in particular. And that appears to be, in my mind, apart from all the other efforts I mentioned, all those things will obviously go on. You'll keep negotiating, you'll keep discussing, you'll keep appealing, maybe you'll keep appeasing to some extent. But the underlying key intervention that we must pursue is making ourselves strong, making ourselves less vulnerable, giving ourselves bargaining power. And that's the only way you'll have an outcome that will give you these key underlying principles that you are trying to uphold. Let me also admit one thing quite honestly. All this that I've described is rooted in the underlying nature of human beings. Human beings in economic transactions are not inherently benevolent. And to that extent, policies of nations are not inherently benevolent. So to expect something different, in my view, would be somewhat unreasonable, somewhat impractical, and somewhat naive. One could not have expected something different. The world has been and always will be shaped by the interaction of your bargaining power with that of others. So whoever has economic domination, whoever has that bargaining power, the outcomes will be shaped in that direction. So I'm not giving any ethical judgment on this. I think all nations and all human beings are ultimately guided by their self-interest. And all these outcomes I mentioned are outcomes coming from that self-interest. So there is no moral or ethical comment in that. And the other lesson from that is that you, in that global marketplace, where countries will engage with each other and arrive at these outcomes, you must acquire bargaining power, you must acquire economic clout. So that is clearly the goal for India and for, I think, all developing countries. Let me once again, in this context of putting your domestic house in order, as I mentioned, the US-China trade war has clearly demonstrated that violating some basic rules of trade, imposing tariffs which are not justified by economic arguments like, infant industry protection for a short and reasonable period of time, is suboptimal. And we have to realize that you cannot resolve widespread inefficiencies in your domestic economy. You cannot address them through tariffs. And you cannot blame the consequences of some of those domestic inefficiencies on the lack of tariffs. So I think clearly there's a lesson for us from what has happened of late, in particular between US and China. And the lesson clearly is that put your house in order. Of course, you need to use legitimate methods to protect your economy. If there is unfair trade, if there is dumping, if there are subsidies aimed at, predatory pricing, if there are, import surges, clearly we have to strongly and very, very proactively use countervailing duties, anti-dumping duties, safeguard duties. They need to be exercised, very, very consciously. To the extent there is an infant industry argument for protecting your industry till it acquires competitiveness, we need to adopt those, protections. And I think broadly that has been our policy also in India. That has been our policy. And within the ambit of that, we need to address domestic inefficiencies. So let me conclude at this point and thank the organizers once again for having me. And I look forward to the further presentations. Thank you.
I want to thank the Commerce Secretary for what I thought was a very candid presentation on how India sees them. Then clearly, for the Indo-Pacific countries, the future of the multilateral trading system is extremely important because it's trade which has driven most of these countries to prosperity. So I'm not going to speak much, but I have a wonderful panel in which we've got some interesting perspectives given the background of these people concerned. I'm afraid, contrary to my previous instruction, we will make it 5 minutes because I cannot believe that people will let the Commerce Secretary go without questions. I'm not provoking, but so I think very quickly, Carlos, my good friend Carlos Correia, who's Executive Director of the South Center, he has a vantage position from Geneva to see what developing countries are doing in terms of reaction to this collapse or this perceived collapse. So Carlos, can I give you 5 to 8 minutes, please? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ambassador Kumar. Secretary of Commerce, ambassadors, distinguished participants. It's a real honor for me and for the South Center to be present in this event. So since I was given a very short time, let me just try to also be very concise. As the Secretary of Commerce has indicated, the WTO system has a number of merits. One of them is to have some predictability, is to provide for non-discrimination clauses, is to provide for a rule-based system. But there are many aspects of the WTO system, as we know it today, which are not perfect or good from the perspective of developing countries. And in fact, Ambassador Mohan Kumar has written an excellent book. I'm making somehow propaganda of this book. Mohan, Negotiation Dynamics of the WTO and Insiders' Accounts. where it is very clearly stated the frustration of developing countries during the overall round and the extent to which they were not able to reach many of the objectives. On the contrary, in this round, there were many issues that were in fact imposed by developed countries that are part of the problem. Just to mention a few of them, the TRIPS agreement. The TRIPS agreement, as you know, as was already mentioned by the Secretary of Commerce, has increased dramatically the level of protection for intellectual property, and also the burden that developing countries are getting in terms of payment for royalties. Since 1990 until 2016, royalty payments have increased 15 times, from 24 billion US dollar to 350 billion US dollar. Most of these are receipts for the United States. Just in the case of India, royalty payments have increased in the last 10 years, or 2005, 2015, from 1 billion to more than 5 billion US dollar. That means that an increase of more than 5 times. TRIPS agreement is another example. The TRIPS agreement thus prevents developing countries to use a very important tool for industrial development, the local content policies that were used extensively by developed countries before. The extent to which performance requirements can be applied to investors has been curtailed, and this is something that has actually limited the capacity of developing countries to develop their industrial policies. Agriculture, it was already mentioned. Although the Ural Round culminated with an agreement on agriculture, this agreement contains many faults. Developed countries were able to continue subsidizing their producers. Cotton is one example. The subsidy given by the United States to protect the farmers in the context of the trade war with China is quite clear, $12 billion for farmers. The problem of food stockpiling, that is a major concern for India, has not been solved. And this is based on a footnote, so when a negotiation of a treaty takes place, take care of the footnotes because they may create a lot of problems. And also in the case of dispute settlement, although it has created a system that allows all member countries to bring its complaints in case of violation, in fact, 80% of the disputes in the dispute settlement system of WTO has been used by developed country or upper middle income countries. Least developed countries have never used the system, and in the case of Africa, only 4 African countries have been able to use the dispute settlement. So there are also asymmetries, which are expressed also in cases in which there is a complaint between a big economy and a small economy. Perhaps one example is the banana case between the European communities and Ecuador, in which Ecuador was able to show that European communities were in violation of the rules. But what kind of impact can trade retaliation imposed by Ecuador have on the European communities, on the European Union economy? So this is a major imbalance. When a big country wins in a complaint, the retaliation may have a major impact on a smaller economy, but the reverse is not the case. So there are many flaws in the system. There are some, as was already mentioned by the Secretary of Commerce, there are some benefits. Actually, the system has helped developing countries to increase their participation in international trade, which reaches now more than 40%. It has also contributed to a significant increase of GDP in developing countries, most probably. So there has been a major increase in that respect. So this is important in the context of the comments made by the Secretary of Commerce about the options for the WTO in the system we'll refer to in a minute. But clearly, as it was already stated in a very eloquent manner, the WTO system is in crisis. There are many indicators. One of them was mentioned, the fact that the appellate body today has 1 member only. So it means that the dispute settlement system is completely frustrated. It was already mentioned the use of the national security clause as an argument in order to impose tariffs. This is, I would say, a mockery of the system. This is beyond any rational interpretation of such a clause. The United States in particular is aiming at abolishing one of the pillars of the WTO system, which is special and differential treatment, arguing that countries such as China or India should not have the right to this special and differential treatment, which is certainly unacceptable in terms of the real situation of these countries. The United States and other countries are pushing for a reform of the WTO based on plurilateral rules rather than or multilateral rules.
2 minutes, Carlos.
Okay. And certainly, perhaps one of the main concerns for many countries is the fact that for some of the members of the WTO, the so-called development round is dead, and in particular, the issue related to agriculture will not be effectively addressed to the benefit of developing countries. Then what can be done? What's the future of WTO? Of course, I share some of the pessimism of the Secretary of Commerce, but I think that there are some elements that we can mention here in 2 minutes. The first one is that because of this attack by a number of industrialized countries to the rule-based system in WTO, developing countries have been put in a position of defending the system as is. And I think this is not the correct position. Developing countries need to defend the WTO system as a rule-based system, but they need position of looking at protecting the system as it is now. The right position should be to take this opportunity to improve the system, and there are many aspects in which this could be done. In fact, it's interesting that after the Marrakesh Agreement was signed, there were a large number of proposals by developing countries to amend the WTO system, and these proposals have now been forgotten, and we are only talking about the proposals which are made by developed countries. So a second comment on this is that it will not be enough just to oppose to these very aggressive proposals by developed countries to reform the WTO. It is indispensable for developing countries to develop their own country proposals. It is encouraging in this respect. A submission has been made by India, South Africa, and other countries in relation to how a reform of the WTO system should look in the future. But then finally, and also coming to one of the options indicated by the Secretary of Commerce, I think this is the opportunity for new coalitions in WTO. 3 of the biggest economies in the world are developing countries. It's China, it's India, and Brazil. So if you have a coalition that includes countries such as South Africa, Indonesia, plus the countries I have mentioned, there should be the capacity for developing countries to get a reform of the WTO or to preserve the essential values of the WTO as a system which is based on rules and not as a system which is based on the exercise of economic power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos, for those insightful comments. John, I think you have an impossible task ahead of you. Please defend the WTO. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to RIS and to the Government of India for inviting me to this event. And it's extraordinary to be here in New Delhi as a Canadian. I got an email from my parents with a picture of them shoveling 3 feet of snow, and I'm walking around in 22 degrees Celsius. It's a little paradise here. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a very relevant topic. Let me start with a joke. There's a couple, an elderly couple, 60 in their early 60s, and they're celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary. And they've been such a lovely couple and so kind that the fairy godmother comes to visit them and says, "You've been so nice, I'm going to grant you each a wish." And the wife says, "Oh, I've always wanted a romantic, round-the-world cruise with my husband." And the fairy godmother raises her magic wand and kazam! She has 2 tickets in her hand. And the husband thinks to himself, "I've always wanted a companion 30 years younger." And the fairy godmother raises her wand and kazam! He turns 93. the moral of the story is be careful what you wish for, it just might come true. And that's basically the theme of my short remarks today. At the end of the Second World War, and after a series of economic crises and 2 devastating world wars, the architects of the system we're talking about today had a simple, even utopian idea. It was the answer to peace, to global peace, lay in spreading global prosperity. If everyone had enough to eat, if everyone had a roof over their head, if they had a job, if they had a stake in a better future, they wouldn't go to war. The idea was to create a positive-sum world of international cooperation, not a zero-sum world of great power rivalry. They've succeeded. I think they've succeeded far beyond what anyone in 1947 would have expected. The global economy's grown 8-fold. World trade has grown an astounding 37-fold since 1950s. We've witnessed the most extraordinary period of growth and economic development in history, bar none. The system started with 23 countries. It's now expanded to 164 countries. Every major economy in the world is now part of a single global economic system. If you had told that to the architects of the system, let alone to the Cold Warriors of that era, they never would have believed you. And finally, we've moved, at least until recent times, towards a system of international rule of law rather than the rule of power. WTO dispute settlement mechanism in the last 20 years has solved 560 disputes just in the last 20 years alone. We sometimes forget those successes. In this sense, I completely agree with the Commerce Secretary. We take it for granted. It's a bit like the air we breathe. We don't know it's around us until it starts to disappear. Maybe that's where we are today. Success, though, has created its own challenges or its own problems. One is just the basic problem of interdependence, which makes cooperation more difficult and which increases the potential for friction. We're dealing with issues today in the WTO and elsewhere that were once strictly domestic and are now spilling over into global affairs: climate change, industrial subsidies, financial reform. We're also dealing with, because of our development success, a huge shift in power. To put it into perspective, when China joined the WTO, it represented just over 2% of world GDP. Today it represents over 18%. It was the 16th largest trader. It's now the #1 trader. The United States, meanwhile, has seen its share of global GDP go from 24% to less than 15%. And these new power shifts have been an unsettling feature for the countries that used to call the shots, and they've also thrust responsibility on countries that in the past never had that power. So we live in a world today which is combining greater interdependence with greater geopolitical rivalries. What's the likely future? Let me just paint 3 possible scenarios. One scenario is that we just muddle along as we are, that nothing changes. I think that's probably the least likely scenario, if only because change is already being thrust upon us. WTO just reported that trade restrictive measures, new barriers imposed by countries, are at their highest level since the financial crisis. They've grown by 27% in just 1 year. Issues are being thrust on the agenda, whether they negotiated or not in the WTO. The EU has just announced new measures to take unilateral trade, to take retaliatory trade action. Now, a number of countries are contemplating new digital taxes at the border. Climate change has already prompted a discussion about border tax adjustments. Change is coming whether the WTO is ready or not. The second option is to go back to a world of regionalism, the very world that the WTO was created to try to resolve, a world of deglobalization and decoupling. That is not an impossible scenario, but it's a scenario that's difficult to imagine. Try to take an issue like e-commerce and resolve it in bilateral or regional trade agreements. Take the issue of agricultural subsidies. You just, by definition, cannot solve that problem in a regional context. And then we get into the truly global issues like climate change, which almost by definition require global approaches. And finally, And here I agree with our previous speaker. What we are really looking at is how to find the means and also the will to reform the system, or take a system that was designed for the 20th century and bring it into the 21st century economy. And on this one, there is grounds for hope. I think this point that was just made, that most of the reform proposals in the WTO have been put on the table by developing countries. We have work ongoing on issues like fish subsidies and agriculture. There are new initiatives of some members, but not all members, on issues like investment, e-commerce, small and medium-sized enterprises, empowerment of women. There is also a series of reform proposals on the table to look at dispute settlement, the way we use committees, and the way we adjudicate disputes. The central question, I think, for everyone is, what's the alternative? We can think of a lot of reasons to criticize the WTO. There are certainly extraordinary ways where the WTO could improve. There's also areas, and here I fully agree with the Commerce Secretary, where it has not lived up to expectations. But in this interdependent world we've created, what's the alternative model? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Harsha, without much ado, former Deputy Director General of WTO, for those of you who don't know, and certainly the last word on trade. Harsha, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar, Commerce Secretary, distinguished panel members, distinguished members of the audience, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank RIS and the Ministry of External Affairs for this opportunity. In my few minutes which I have, I will focus on the topic, the future of the multilateral trading system. One can discuss many things here, but what will happen in the system? And the reason I think we are focusing on it is what the Commerce Secretary said. It is a system which is of value. We can criticize it. We can try and see ways in which it needs to improve, but even salvaging it today is an issue which has become a major endeavor. So in an interconnected world where just imagine a traffic light system with, which is functioning well, and an ad hoc traffic light system. You go much further, much quicker, so a lot more traffic passes through. It's the analogy of trade. When there is predictability, stability, and order, and people follow the rules, then a lot more trade takes place. And that system is today challenged, not by developing countries, no, one developed country. There's only one country which has challenged it and led us to this situation, the largest economy in the world. The countries or members of WTO which are trying to find solutions are both developed and developing countries. India itself has proposals with EU and other developed countries. So we should not see this as a developing country point. This is my first point. Second, US, people think there might be two different situations. So I'll talk of likelihoods. I'll tell you what I think is likely to happen in the end. One is a strategic tool, a lever of power to change the rules in such a way that, according to US perception, the best trade regulatory system is in place so that unfair trade policies are addressed. There is no overreach according to their estimation of the system of dispute settlement, etc. So it's a strategic thing, focused on China, focused on the WTO system's improvement. And there are some in the WTO who agree with the US, and there are many who do not agree with the US. The other one is the US today is in a bilateral mode. It says, I will not follow any rules, but every system which is available to me, I will use it for my own benefit. It is the unfettered expression of power. So I will have unilateral measures which violate most favored nation treatment, which violate national treatment, which violate the erstwhile sacrosanct concept, the way security was seen. So they have violated the fundamental principles brazenly. And they have done this, some say for strategic reasons. More and more, I am coming to the thinking, and it's not an individual per se, it is a thinking, that this combination of thinking, which may change with individuals changing, but this combination of thinking is more likely to be the second unfettered one, because I will use the system to control you. I will go to the dispute settlement process. US has taken disputes to the dispute settlement process while destroying it. Because if I win, I have you on the mat. If I lose, I'll not agree. So this is where we are at present in the WTO system. So suppose I take the strategic. You reform the appellate body, you develop new rules, and new rules are being negotiated. WTO is not dead. Many people, I remember when I was a Deputy Director General in my first term, which my second term started in 2009, some ministers met me and said, you must be relaxing, WTO is dead. I think it's closer to death now than it was then. But why and how people are trying to revive it is what I want to focus on. So there is negotiations going on, but negotiations today is not multilateral, it's plurilateral. Committees and councils are actually active. Data suggests that 60% of the problems which you face are solved just by talking to each other. 60% of the disputes taken to the dispute settlement process never go to panel. So the forum which exists is functioning with trepidation of the final thing. The second is unfettered use of power by the US. So there, the US does not bind itself to the WTO rules. The rest of the members do. In fact, if US does not follow the rules, and there is no other mechanism to sustain those rules, we will see an attrition of the multilateral trading system. Others will say, why should I follow the rules? What is there which actually will sustain me? So, if here you change the scenario and say the US leadership changes its perspective and now thinks that it actually will allow establishment of the new system, which people have been trying to come up with for appellate body, but their main focus is on China. Their main focus is on China.
2 minutes, Harsh. Thank you.
Thank you. Their main focus is on China, and if they have to negotiate something on China, there is a trilateral initiative which can go further. It will not take less than 5-6 years. The system will go towards attrition. Suppose now US doesn't follow the rules, but other members do. In fact, EU and Canada have made an agreement. They have adopted the appellate body rules of procedure for arbitration. And appellate body previous members will be arbitrators. So it's as if it's the appellate body all over again, bilaterally agreed. EU and Norway have agreed on that. China is saying, let us, many more people agree. So if that system comes through, then there will be two tracks. One with the US not agreeing, but being a member of WTO, and one where those who have agreed will go on as if there is an appellate process there. And these two tracks will go on. The whole thing is, if we have these two tracks, the issue will be who will be part of the track which actually is agreeing to these arbitration processes, because that's the full implementation of the system, so to say. US will not be there, so you'll have a situation where the largest economy in the world is actually not subject to the rules. Its truck will go through honking its horn, trying to make way in the traffic, and there will come a time when other traffic will not make the way for the US. So this longer term US will be weaker, but the system will also be weaker. we have to see what we do. Do we focus on ourselves? Because we can decide, no, if US is not following the rules, I'll also not follow the rules. Or we focus on the system. And if we value the system, if we want to strengthen it, the answer is very clear. And in my perception, because the EU, as John said, the EU is now coming up with its own law that if you take part in the dispute settlement process, i.e. panel process, but you don't go to the next stage, I will then, depending on the result of the panel, levy retaliatory trade measures on you. Basically, it's a rule against the US. So if that is likely to happen, there will be tensions in the system, there will be rethinking in Congress, which has already started thinking, but the new form which emerges will be plurilateral rather than multilateral in this way, because US need not be part of the system for the next 5 to 7 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsha. I thought that was really to the point and various scenarios. Dr. Vardhan, your country has been eminently fortunate with the US-China trade war, so I don't know if you're going to welcome
maybe,
it. Thank
you
you.
ask me about China and Vietnam later. Just. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Even I don't know why I am invited here. Not so important like other people. But I am the last, so basically I brief with 4 straight points. WTO and Vietnam as a newer member, and maybe successful case of joining WTO, right? And second, what the problem WTO and multilateral system we are facing now, and how we move forward as the role of the role we can play, the Asia can play in supporting WTO to move forward. Okay, a little bit about Vietnam and WTO. We joined WTO the year 2007, just more than 10 years ago, right? After we joined, investment, FDI, trade, export expanded, significantly. And Vietnam become most open developing country in terms of trade and the role FDI can play in the economy, right? Trade to GDP in Vietnam now more 200%, right? So very, very open. But I don't think there's most significant impact on Vietnam. I think WTO like a catalyst for our domestic reform. So 2 lessons we learned from joining WTO and from deepening integration. 1, we understand integration is not just about opportunity. There's challenges, there's a risk. But without integration, we cannot develop. So we take risks. That's 1 lesson we learned. Second, right, in the case of Vietnam, what we learned is that we don't wait until we have enough capability to implement the commitment. But we think commitment as catalyst for, as I mentioned, institutional reform. So that's why we join very high quality FTA like TPP, CPTPP, and now Vietnam EU FTA. Even some article under chapter under Vietnam EU FTA quality higher than under the CPTPP or TPP, right? Okay, that's about Vietnam WTO. Second, what the problem we are facing? I think we have 4 or 5 challenges, problem. 1, we know that proliferation of FTAs, right? So policymakers, the leaders, drift away from the role of WTO. Even in Vietnam, we love WTO, right? But over the last 7 years, 5 years, because we joined 16 FTAs, as I mentioned, including high-quality FTA. So sometimes we forget WTO, right? Even we love, even we understand the value, because we joined many FTAs, right? The second problem, there's one, we know there's, protectionism, extreme nationalism, populism on that one, very political reason. The third one on previous speaker already mentioned, WTO so far cannot be dealing effectively with many issues we concern today, right? GVC, global value chain, connectivity, facilitation, behind the border, services, not say about digital trade, right? And how to balance between agriculture, liberalization, and food security, right? That's been answer problem, WTO. And how WTO can incorporate some development issues into the trade arrangement, right? Inclusiveness, sustainability, for example, under the TPP of Vietnam-EU, a chapter on labor standard, environmental standard. Can we have that under WTO? I think very difficult, right? And last, but not least, I think the way of negotiation on, we know there's a problem. A single package, we cannot have that, right? And we have more than 160 members, how we can have consensus. So we need to have another approach for negotiation, but so far we didn't have any consensus. How we can move forward? We think FTAs, even high quality, cannot, substitute for WTO for many reasons. One, there's less distortion of resource allocation. FTA, that's discriminatory. Second, DSM, dispute settlement mechanism, that's the best so far instrument to enhance the rule-based trade regime, right? And should be effective one, and many others. So I think the key thing is we have to pick up the priority for WTO, right? Number one, I think there's a DSM, right? DSM mechanism, dispute settlement mechanism. We have to defend that mechanism. Second, as I mentioned, we need to take into account the new issues of the 21st trade century, behind the border, services, development issues, and maybe together with picking up priority, we need to have like a minded group, following a plurilateral approach rather than just kind of multilateral, right? And my last comment about the role of Asia. I think Asia already have a strong, clear commitment in supporting WTO multilateral system, but we need in action, right? So I think follow open regionalism, that's one of the key, whether we talk about CPTPP or RCEP, right? Second, at the border, behind the border issues, how we can implement effectively under the FTAs, right? High quality and other FTA in the region. And last but not least, cooperation. So if you can do that, good. So this can be replicated at more critical mass at the global level. So I think that's on my, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we still have some time. I'm really grateful for all the panelists for having fallen in line with my dictatorial tendency, but I had no choice. I had a few things to say myself, actually, but I think I'll skip it. Any questions at all? Oh, if I had known this, I would have given my panelists full time. I thought there will be people with questions. Yes, Ambassador Seshadri. Mike, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's one issue which I was wondering if any of you might like to address. Because apart from the various transgressions or perpetrations of, you can say, illegal act that has been mentioned, and also naming of one country, which we are all aware what we are talking about. But the WTO system, in many ways, is based on the assumption of a market-based system. Now, if decisions are not market-based, but if non-market considerations or non-market operators distort the system in a significant way, that also needs to be taken note of. And we need to see how that can be dealt with for any reform of WTO or any new system that you might think of. I think this is a major issue. And this is what US have been talking about. So is there something that the panelists might talk about? Because if the coalition consists of players who are involved in that system and who want to protect their systems and not really have a market-based system, how do you envisage a new system emerging? I think this is a key consideration that needs to be looked at. Thank you.
So thank you. While I don't know if there are any other questions, but can I request somebody to, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I believe Harsha or John should be able to handle it. Harsha.
Thank you very much. In fact, that is what the scenario I was saying, that if the perception and engagement of the US way of thinking changes, they will focus on the kind of issue you're talking about, which is being worked upon. So you've raised two points. One is development of new disciplines which address both existing policies like subsidies, but in a tighter way, and which also address policies relating to competition policy or IPR, etc., in a manner in which it is seen to be more fair. So the second issue you have raised it, if in WTO decision is by consensus, then how can you come up with such an agreement? Because the main country against which the thrust of the initiative would also need to be part of the consensus. So there are two possibilities. One is to have some kind of a breathing space where you allow stricter and stricter policies coming in. And another, which is where I see the system going ultimately, is that they have already taken the floor under the feet of most favored nation treatment. With standards coming in, you already have a world which is in effect non-MFN, non-most favored nation treatment. The EU law is you do not follow through with the dispute settlement process, then I will impose a trade measure. Something along these lines is what might be thought of in order to identify when there is a concern, and if somebody does not agree to address that concern, then leeway ought to be provided. It's a leap into the future, but based on what the EU law is already predicting. So that's the way I think it will happen. But for that, US has to be in that role.
John, do you want to say something, or is that okay? Any other questions? I recognize the presence of the Honorable External Affairs Minister as well. If there are no further questions, I'd like to close the panel. Any other questions for the Commerce Secretary, for the members of the panel? You're a very kind audience. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for the thought-provoking session, sirs. May I please request the chair of the session to present mementos to the lead speaker and the panelists. May I kindly invite Dr. Prabir Dey, RIS, to present a memento to the chair for this session, Ambassador Kumar. We will now proceed to take a short tea break of 10 minutes